Let's break down two wide receivers, two running backs, a quarterback, and a tight end who I think are some of the best current values in 2025 fantasy football drafts. These are players that are going a little bit under the radar and I think ultimately are going to be absolutely awesome pieces to your 2025 fantasy football rosters. Let's kick things off with Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, who's currently sitting at an ADP of 30 overall on the Sleeper app and going in about the same exact range on Underdog Fantasy as well. This is a player who finished as the wide receiver 10 last year. The wide receiver 10 in full PPR, and I really feel like a lot of fantasy managers right now are not viewing Garrett Wilson like he just came off of his best season ever. And I know there's a lot of issues with the Jets right now. The departure of Aaron Rodgers, the addition of Justin Fields. How does that make you feel about the passing game? Has been an up and down franchise, up and down couple of seasons for Garrett Wilson and the New York Jets. But like I said, he is coming off of his best statistical season yet. He had 154 targets, 101 receptions, just over 1,100 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns. I think the interesting thing to kind of point out about Garrett Wilson last season is that Davante Adams, once he was traded to the Jets, took away a ton of volume from Garrett Wilson, a ton of potential opportunities, especially deep down the stretch. There were plenty of times when Garrett Wilson was open or close enough to open, and Aaron Rodgers was only looking to Davante Adams. I mean, it was pretty bad at certain points in the season, but even with all that, I mean, between weeks 14 and 17, you got double-digit production out of Garrett Wilson in each and every one of those weeks. And overall on the season, if we're looking at single-digit fantasy performances for Garrett Wilson last year, we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4 single-digit fantasy performances on the entire season. That's 13 games with double-digit fantasy performances, and he averaged 14.8 fantasy points per game. So I understand that when we look at Garrett Wilson, we're not entirely sure of what to expect because Justin Fields is the quarterback. He is, historically known as a run-first quarterback, and the sample size that we got out of Justin Fields with the Steelers last year was not entirely promising, but that was a completely different offense, and it was an Arthur Smith offense that I think really held Justin Fields back. But one of the main points that I want to look at here, if you are worried about the addition of Garrett Wilson, the addition of Justin Fields at the quarterback position for the Jets, is just don't forget we're not that far removed from a season in which DJ Moore was absolutely fed by Justin Fields at the quarterback position. In 2023, DJ Moore was the wide receiver 6 in full PPR formats, 136 targets, 96 receptions, over 1,300 receiving yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns. Justin Fields absolutely force-fed DJ Moore in 2023 as a wide receiver 1. And we look at the makeup of this roster for the Jets. There's nobody I'm concerned about taking away those potential targets and receptions next to Garrett Wilson. We're looking at Allen Lazard, Josh Reynolds, Malachi Corley, Xavier Gibson, and rookie Mason Taylor at the tight end position, and maybe some sprinkles of Breece Hall and the rest of that running back room. But ultimately, this is a clear-cut wide receiver 1 who's going to get all of the volume, all the major looks from Justin Fields. Garrett Wilson could be locked in for an even better fantasy season than last year. And even if there's slight regression, we're still looking at a top 12, top 15 fantasy football wide receiver. So ultimately, his ADP is somewhat appropriate for sure. But if we're looking at the best case scenario for Garrett Wilson, which I think could absolutely happen this year, it would put him in the top 6 range at the wide receiver position. So do I necessarily think that's going to happen? Not entirely, but at his current ADP, I think he's absolutely worth the selection to just go out and get a bona fide, solidified wide receiver 1. And if you're starting your strat with like a double hero RB approach, you just want to get a clear-cut wide receiver 1 who's going to produce on a consistent basis, I think Garrett Wilson is the perfect selection. Regardless of what your strategy is, I think that Garrett Wilson is going to be a phenomenal pick at his current ADP. He is a player that I find myself leaving fantasy football mock drafts and real fantasy football drafts currently left and right with. While there are some options in that range like T. Higgins or Marvin Harrison Jr. who might offer a bit more upside, I think you guys should definitely start to consider leaving some of your fantasy drafts with Garrett Wilson in the third round. All right, next up, let's take a look at Jacobi Meyers of the Raiders, who finished last year as the wide receiver 19. 129 targets, 87 receptions, just over 1,000 receiving yards, and 4 receiving touchdowns. This was Jacobi Meyers' best fantasy season yet. He's sitting at an ADP of 88.1 overall on the Sleeper app, and he goes in about the 7th round on Underdog Fantasy. So I have been leaving a lot of fantasy football drafts and mock drafts with Jacobi Meyers lately. This is a player you guys have heard me talk about throughout the offseason. And, those numbers that we just named in terms of what he did last year, he was doing that with a mixture of Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew at the quarterback position. Things are going to be a lot more clear-cut with Geno Smith as the starting quarterback for the Raiders. JSN, one of the hottest wide receivers in fantasy football right now in terms of emergence, right? I mean, this is who he was supported by, Geno Smith, and now this is the quarterback for Jacobi Meyers. Overall, you're getting the wide receiver 1 for a given team when you draft Jacobi Meyers. Yes, I get it. You can easily make the argument that he's not the wide receiver 1 because Brock Bowers plays, football for the Raiders. But in terms of we're looking at pure position, Brock Bowers is a tight end, Jacobi Meyers is a wide receiver. And once again, we look at the makeup of this roster. I do like rookie Jack Beck, don't get me wrong, but we got Trey Tucker here and a bunch of nobodies. So it's really Myers, and then it is Brock Bowers, right? These are the two guys who are going to get the volume in the passing game. And obviously the run game is going to be a little bit more substantial this year with Ashton Genty at the running back position. But ultimately, I just think Myers is such a good value. You're not spending hardly any draft capital on a player that averaged 14.5 fantasy points per game last year, has averaged double-digit fantasy points in each of the last 3 seasons. And you're walking away with him in the 7th or 8th round of fantasy football drafts right now. This is a perfect type of flex player to try and target in full PPR formats, and you're walking away essentially spending no draft capital on him. So I am drafting a lot of Jacobi Meyers right now. Love his ADP currently. I think you guys need to take a stronger look at Jacobi Meyers when he is on the board in your fantasy football drafts. All right, moving along to the running back position. If you guys have followed the channel for any amount of time, you guys know that I am a big DeAndre Swift fan. Say what you want about DeAndre Swift, okay? Last season was still a tad bit disappointing. Don't get me wrong. I understand it. But he still averaged 12.6 fantasy points per game. And this is one of those players who just constantly falls back in fantasy drafts. And he has averaged 12.5 or more fantasy points per game in 3 straight seasons. So it was the RB21 last year in fantasy points per game, RB24 the year before that, and the RB15 the year before that in fantasy points per game scored. He's been a top 21 fantasy football running back 3 years in a row. So we're not looking at massive upside here by any stretch of the imagination, but currently I just think that DeAndre Swift is a good value. Currently on Sleeper, he is going at an ADP of 79.5, and in Underdog Fantasy, he goes just about the top of the 7th round. So you're walking away with what I think is really good value. Once again, not a ton of upside here, but in terms of a running back that you're going to be able to plug in emergency settings in the flex or as an RB2, DeAndre Swift, I think, is going to be that guy who you can rely on a week in, week out basis to at least get you somewhere between 10 and 15 fantasy points. But on top of that, we have such an improved offensive line for the Bears in this offseason, both through free agency and somewhat in the draft. But also, we have an entire culture change, hopefully an entire offensive change with Ben Johnson as the new head coach for the Bears, and overall, just a better looking Bears offense. Sophomore season for Caleb Williams. A lot of people expected the Bears to bring in some stiff competition against DeAndre Swift through the draft or through free agency. And while they did draft one running back in the 7th round, who I know, Ben Johnson has had some kind words, has had some praise for as of recently, they didn't really bring in intense competition against DeAndre Swift. So I still think he's the clear-cut RB1 until further notice for the Bears. So there's a lot of hype right now, especially in dynasty settings around the Bears and the future of this offense, but there's just in no way any anticipation or praise for what DeAndre Swift could potentially do this current season. I will say DeAndre Swift's ADP was much more pushed back earlier in the offseason when people were talking about like the Bears potentially drafting Ashton Genty and things like that. And he has moved up a little bit in ADP, but ultimately I still think he's a fantastic value. So if you believe in the Bears offense going into 2025, more red zone opportunities, more touchdowns scored by this offense as a whole, DeAndre Swift is going to be a part of that, no doubt about it in my mind. So where he's currently going in fantasy football mock drafts and real drafts, I think he is an absolute steal and a player that you guys should start strongly considering drafting. All right, another running back that I want to talk about is Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders, who's really an interesting running back to look at when we look at 2024, right? Not the best overall metrics here. I mean, we're looking at 11.4 fantasy points per game, which is not too bad because this is a player who we're drafting with an ADP of 86.4 on Sleeper. His ADP on Underdog is pretty close, going somewhere between the end of the 7th, beginning of the 8th round. But we look at last year, 799 rushing yards, 8 rushing touchdowns, 159 receiving yards. Obviously, Austin Eckler had a big role in terms of the receiving back on this team. But, you know, for all the things that went well for the Commanders last year, it feels like Brian Robinson's season got a little bit overshadowed. And I think the big part of that is because, you know, the first couple weeks of the season, weeks 1 through 7 specifically, he missed week 6. But outside of that, weeks 1 through 7, he had 10 or more fantasy points in every single game, 13 or more fantasy points in all those games except for 1. But he did get hurt in that week 7 game against Carolina, and it just didn't really feel like Brian Robinson really got, you know, into the swing of things after that. He had some good moments, don't get me wrong, in weeks where he scored touchdowns, like week 11 against Philly, week 13 against Tennessee, then had an average game against the Saints in week 15 as well with 11.7 fantasy points. But outside of those performances, he gave you single digits, right? And really the offense shifted due to game script in a lot of those, like week 12 against Dallas, week 16 against Philly, where they were passing a lot more as well. But nonetheless, Brian Robinson still had a really good season, was a top 30 fantasy football running back. So don't get me wrong, his ADP is pretty much appropriate. But what I really want to hone in on here is that I think going into 2025 fully healthy, we could get a lot more of what we saw out of Brian Robinson in the first couple weeks of the season and hopefully get that for an entire season. Now, the issue with Brian Robinson Jr. is that, you know, he hasn't yet to play in a full season. His rookie year, just 12 games played, 2023, 15 games played. Then last year, like we touched on, 14 total games played. So what we're looking for is as much health as possible in terms of this theory here. We could definitely see a much better overall finish for Brian Robinson in 2025. We'll find out, but I still think where he's going currently in mock drafts and real drafts, he's absolutely worth the selection. Once again, this is another team, a lot of hype. Sophomore season for Jaden Daniels, the addition of Deebo Samuel, just a little bit more time for everyone to mesh and gel together. Cliff Kingsbury offense, an offense that I talked about a lot last offseason as an offense that I liked, and I still like it going into 2025. This is a solid player for where he's going. I'm not expecting anything crazy out of Brian Robinson, but once again, low draft capital here for you guys. This is a player, especially in zero RB builds or double hero RB builds where you're waiting a couple rounds to draft a third running back. This is a guy that you guys should absolutely be targeting in your 2025 fantasy football drafts. Let's take a look at a sophomore quarterback who hasn't been mentioned yet, and that is Bo Nix of the Denver Broncos, who I just absolutely love where Bo Nix is currently being drafted in fantasy football drafts and mock drafts. On the Sleeper app, he's sitting on an ADP of 84.8, and on Underdog, he goes as late as the 9th round. If you are holding back to draft a quarterback, Bo Nix should be an absolute target for you guys. He finished as the QB7 in 2024, over 3,700 passing yards, 29 passing touchdowns to 12 picks, 430 rushing yards, and 4 rushing touchdowns in his rookie campaign. I was a big advocate early in the season last year to consider Bo Nix as a startable player every single week early in the year, like as early as week 3 in week 5 when he really started to get rolling. And ultimately, I think that Bo Nix is going to have a very good sophomore season. I think that he can easily progress from what he did last year in terms of fantasy points per game, sitting at 19.4, and hopefully get over that kind of 20-ish points per game mark that we really want out of a quarterback. But even if Bo Nix regresses somewhat in his sophomore season, you're still looking at an easy top 10 quarterback when it comes to fantasy football. We look at the makeup of this offense, right? I'm not worried about anything here. Some people kind of looking at things like, is RJ Harvey at the running back position going to be enough? I know there's a lot of hype around RJ Harvey, but for all that hype, there's always some naysayers. And then some people expected them to add a wide receiver either via free agency or maybe earlier in the draft. They did add a wide receiver in the draft in rookie Pat Bryant, who I like a lot, and they did so in the 3rd round. So still relatively high draft capital, but early in the offseason, it was expected that they would maybe draft a wide receiver in the 1st round of the draft, but they did add veteran tight end Evan Engram in the offseason through free agency as well. So I'm also high on Marvin Mims, and I think he's going to either be a very good wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 for this offense. They have a great offensive line, and they have a very solid defense. So the defense part could end up hurting us in terms of like game script and wanting to see, Bo Nix on the field more, throw the football more because I need to score more points, all that stuff. But this is a good overall roster with a good system led by Sean Payton. I think that Bo Nix is only going to grow in his sophomore season. And once again, you're not spending high draft capital on Bo Nix, who I think will be locked in as long as he's fully healthy this year as a top 10 fantasy football quarterback. Don't know if the upside's always going to be crazy here, but I think, like I said, in that 20-ish fantasy points per game mark is easily obtainable for Bo Nix and his sophomore season. So once again, you are not spending high draft capital here. If you're going to kick the can at quarterback, wait a little bit in your drafts. I think that Bo Nix is an absolute smash selection and a player who's going to be fantastic in 2025 fantasy football. Let's quickly mention one tight end on the very same team as Bo Nix, who we just talked about, and that is Evan Engram of the Denver Broncos. This is a player who I am targeting specifically in a lot of drafts and mock drafts right now because I tend to always select tight ends late. I don't spend early draft capital on tight ends very often. He's sitting at an ADP of 94.5 on Sleeper and pretty much in the same area on Underdog going around the 10th round. So for me, I am smashing the selection button on Evan Engram every single time. I know he only played 9 games last year and only averaged 9.9 fantasy points per game, but he averaged double-digit fantasy points in the 2 previous seasons. He was the tight end 5 in 2022 and the tight end 2 in 2023. And Sean Payton has shown throughout his history of coaching that he loves to utilize the tight end position. On top of that, there were reports that Bo Nix specifically asked to try and get Evan Engram added to the Broncos roster in free agency. So there's definitely going to be some sort of chemistry, hopefully, between Bo Nix and Evan Engram. I know he's a little bit older at age 30, and he's coming off of a season where he did have some injury issues. For the most part, Evan Engram has always been an athletic freak, and I know we didn't really get that for the most part of his career with the Giants outside of his rookie season. But like I said, 2022, 2023, we are not that far removed from those 2 seasons. And you look at last year, off of 47 receptions, he still had 365 receiving yards, 7.7 yards per catch, only 1 touchdown. But the Jaguars had a lot of issues last year, carousel of quarterbacks after the injury to Trevor Lawrence, or really just Mac Jones, but then Mac Jones was hurt for a little bit there as well. So it wasn't necessarily the best offensive situation for Evan Engram last year. But ultimately, I think where he's going in drafts, especially if you're going to kind of wait to draft a tight end, I think this is a player with a lot of upside going into 2025. Or even if you spend early draft capital on a tight end and you want to kind of solidify your roster at the position, Evan Engram, a very solid pick where he's currently going in 2025 fantasy football drafts. That'll do it for today's video. There are 2 wide receivers, 2 running backs, a quarterback, and tight end that I think are awesome values in your current 2025 fantasy football mock drafts and real drafts. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. But more importantly, if you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, drop me a comment down below. I'll answer each and every comment on this video. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, You saw it here on The Catch.